that's why we're here.
That's
and
why
your
we're here.
and your book.
So, Lisa's publisher just got me her book last night because they're very mad at her because she's a raging narcissist. They've had all sorts of issues.
It's true. Yeah.
No, there was a hang up. So I got
Yeah.
it last night. I usually read her stuff right away. And because it's a Lisa Unger book, I started reading it thinking I should at least know what the book's about before we talk.
True.
And I bit off like a third of the book in one hunk going to bed late. It is fantastic. So here's the premise. I'm going to tell you about Lisa Unger's book. So there's a mom named Adele, mother of 2 kids.
Yeah.
Her husband has left their small town in what state?
I'm sorry. In what state? He's left there small. Like I don't know that I really ever
Name
talked
the
about
state?
that. No, it's really just sort of like
I've already
any
screwed up
town.
the pitch.
No, it's fine. So go ahead.
Or
Yeah.
Any town,
USA.
But he has kind of screwed over everybody in the town
Yes.
with ill business
Yes.
dealings. And she's a former hardcore athlete. She's got 2 kids, but they're sort of the pariahs in this town. And so she wants to do something new to reinvigorate herself and her life. And her son happens to be a fan of a guy called Maverick, who's online, who does these extreme, like, those extreme haunted houses. And so he basically has an extreme, like, hide and seek in deserted, exotic places. And so her son kind of puts her up for this, and she's looking for a change and to figure out her own life. And she goes off onto this adventure, which very quickly starts to deteriorate into terrifying insanity. And what I love about this is what I love about all your books, which is there's so much character and there's so much dynamic. They're always about the relationships between all the characters. It's very well rounded. Everyone's seen from multiple perspectives. There's not just one stamp on for how the characters go. But they're also so wonderfully high concept. And in a way, I think this is your highest concept book in a while.
Yeah, I guess the idea of high concept is always like a little bit apart from me or from the way I conceive of books. Like I don't have a lot of intellectual sort of decision making when it comes to what I want to write. Like I don't think, oh, I want to write a book about this. Like that's just sort of not how it works for me. I have, in this case, there was like kind of a love at first sight moment with a setting. And then I had like an ongoing obsession with YouTube celebrity and gaming and, the relationships that are forming in the gaming world and like just trying to understand how that technology is rewriting our relationships and all that. And so I have these 2 kinds of things going on. And then like, there's kind of like a collision. And then I have a person in my head and then the story starts from there. So it's not like I have like, oh, I want to write about this topic or I want to write about this thing. It's like,
you got to write from the ground up.
I do. I have to write from the inside out.
I always think the first thing that comes to me when I'm writing are always like snatches of scenes or bits of dialogue or conflicts.
Right,
I never
exactly.
start. It's funny because there was one time I was on a TV show and my showrunner, he always said, he's like, well, this week's episode, I want the theme to be betrayal. And I was like, I have no idea how to start there.
Exactly.
It's way too abstract to try and come with that. For me, it's got to be like ground up, like 2 characters in conflict.
Right.
It's usually for me too when there's an ethical dilemma that my character will respond to different from any other character.
Right. And that's one of the things I love about Evan Smoke in your series, like Gregg's series, the Orphan X series, and his new book Nemesis. Like he is just one of those writers who gets everything right every single time. Like it is, it's full action, tech, incredibly cool. You get immediately sucked in, but just by the slickness and the coolness of it. But he's also a beautiful writer and such a rich sort of explorer of character. And Evan's journey, because I've read every single thing that Gregg has ever written, and this character journey, I think, is one of my favorite character arcs because Evan is like. Or the Orphan X program is like, one of these programs where, he had no one. He was sort of taken in to be trained as an assassin by a man who, I guess, in a lot of ways loved him, I think. And who Evan loved as much as, he has access to that. And so this is like, a character, an assassin. It could be so many things, but instead it's this incredibly rich story about this man trying to, merge 2 parts of himself. So like the ultimate conflict for Evan, regardless of what he's going on for him in any book, is what's going on for him within himself.
It's a good thing we like each other's writing. This would be the
No,
worst
it'd be
event ever.
so-
It's super awkward. Like if it got to her and she's like, I don't know, it's kind
I
of
don't know,
like he's
it's
down
like-
the middle.
God, it's like,
It's kind of like
he's fine.
it's action
Okay.
porn. It's just very mediocre. The key line for me in the series, when Evan's taken out of a foster home at the age of 12, he's trained to be an assassin in a silo. And one of the biggest turns I had around the series was I thought, instead of this being like the worst, most miserable thing that ever happened to him, where it's more of a haunted, traumatized past,
Right.
what if the guy who raises him, former CIA station agent named Jack Johns, loves this kid?
Mhm.
And the first thing Jack tells him is, the hard part isn't going to be making you a killer. The hard part is keeping you human. And so the series is really about this black and white thinking assassin. It's almost, I think about the first book, like it's almost like he realizes he's Pinocchio, but he wants to be a real boy.
Right.
That's
yeah.
the start of Orphan X.
Yeah.
And it's really is a series about him trying to figure out how to learn to speak. You know, he was taught everything: mixed martial arts fighting, eskrima knife fighting, drown proofing, foreign etiquette, foreign languages, military history. But he was never taught how to speak the strange language of intimacy.
Right. And he gets so confused. Like he's not confused by anything in his environment. But when he starts to feel things for people, he's just like, oh my God, like what's happening? And I love that about him. I love the way and how he's slowly sort of integrating. I think he is.
Well, that's the aim. That's when I kind of knew I could.
Yeah.
Look, we spend more waking hours with our characters than we do with our families, which is true.
Sorry, honey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's true for all of us with work if you think about it.
I mean, it is true.
It's crazy. So it's
yeah.
got to be something that's compelling, that we're working on and that's working on us in
Right.
a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, tell me about the setting. You said you fell in love with the setting in this.
Yeah, I did. So we were my family and I went on a trip to the Azores, and which is like a beautiful chain of islands in the Atlantic, Portuguese islands. They're about 2,500 kilometers from the coast of the U.S. and about 1,500 kilometers from the coast of Europe, and it's just a very beautiful, dramatic, gorgeous place. Very sleepy still, kind of untouched. Just amazing. And so we were there, and we were about to go out on a hike. We were going to hike the rim of a volcanic lake when this dramatic storm kind of swept in and sent us like racing back to our car. So instead of doing this hike, we wound up driving back to the hotel, which is like, okay, who really wants to hike anyway? Let's go back to the spa. And so we, on our way, we kind of came across this abandoned structure. It was like this gigantic hotel, we would learn later, that was built in the 1980s. It went bankrupt within about 5 years. And it had just sat there, crumbling for all this time. And it was like this just gigantic black structure that just kind of jutted out of the green. And it was like surrounded by signs like na entra and peligra, which I think in any language is clear, danger, stay away. But I was sort of like, well, they don't mean me, right? So we, and I was with my daughter, so maybe it wasn't like necessarily my finest parenting hour. But she's used to sort of semi-safe excursions. So we were all basically like, let's go in and check this place out. And so we did.
Now, was the storm intensifying?
No, it's gone. Like
Okay.
this is the drama of the Azores, right? Like the storms sweep in and they're gone, and it's pure blue again, right? Like so, the place was just completely, covered in graffiti, and it was like nature was like kind of taking it back. There was like trees growing out of the concrete, and everything had been fully looted. Like there was no glass, there was no fixtures, and the wind just kind of howled through, and it was just amazing. It was beautiful. It was like a complete ruin. And I was like, wow, I'm absolutely going to write about this. Like, didn't know how or where it was going to, find its way in, but like that was my love at first sight moment with the setting, which doesn't always happen. It's not
Did you scribble down notes when you got back to the hotel?
I took copious, just video. I just took so many pictures of it and videotaped everything. And then they used, or on my phone, and then they used that footage for, marketing later. They did a really cool trailer with all my footage. And if you follow me on Instagram, you'll go scroll back a little bit, you'll see all the footage.
That's so great.
Yeah, it was really cool.
I always think that the job of us when we're doing research, and you didn't even know you were doing research.
No,
right?
exactly.
You were trying to have
And so much of it is like that, right? I mean,
so much is being open to opportunity.
Yeah.
You know, I talk to younger writers and they're like, well, I want to fill in these blanks. I have to find this expert and fill in the blanks in the story. And, you know, one of the things is we're trying to pull on kind of the eye masks of our characters and see the world through their eye holes. We're trying to see and feel what they are. So a lot of the research is just spending time in environments and talking to people and seeing what opportunities show themselves.
Yeah.
One of my favorite research stories where I learned that early on, it's my third book. I was a kid. I was like 22 when I was writing this book. And I needed to talk to a guy. I set a book at the UCLA Medical Center. It was called Do No Harm. And I had to interview this lab tech. And the only time that he could interview me was literally while he was parting out cadavers. He was carving them up to send the different body parts to different departments. So the head, we're going to neurology. The joints, we're going to the orthopods. The feet, we're going to the podiatrists. So I'm sitting there interviewing him, like wishing I'd worn galoshes. And he finishes with this body. And he walks across, and there's these two giant metal doors, the size of that whole back wall. And he pulls one open, and inside are 24 corpses suspended with scissor figure 8 clamps that pinch them at the ear, and their feet are just swaying like this above the surface. And he grabs one by the arm, and there's like a Texas chainsaw track in the ceiling, and he drags it across this chain and lays it down on the table and starts carving it up. Now, they store the bodies this way because if you store bodies flat, then they distort, and that makes them less useful to medical students during anatomy. And so they're stored in this fashion. And like you, with the Pelagroso in a different language, like haunted, crumbling place where your daughter and you were like have a 70% chance of surviving.
Right.
I just thought this was like the coolest thing I'd ever seen.
Right.
And so I had a scene later in the book that my main character was fleeing at night through the hospital. He needed somewhere to hide. It was perfect. And if you can marry it to reality, it's like carry the reader across the suspension of disbelief.
Yeah.
Then it becomes real as opposed to just like haunted mansion, haunted house, haunted environment.
Right. And it's like you can't believe like how much research goes into like so much research happens all the time. Like it's a sort of, for me, it's a continuum of like researching, writing, reading, living, experiencing, being available to what happens. And then like you can't believe how much of that you have to do in order to write like sort of one authentic sentence. Yeah. Like your research doesn't always wind up in the book, but your primary, you have to have almost a primary knowledge of a thing in order to write about it with any verisimilitude.
I want to say it was Laura Lippman had this really funny line that she said someone said to her once, because sometimes when you do all this research, you want to just put it in the book because you endured it, or you want to just show how smart you are. But you should never, like the author should never be present in the story. And she said somebody said to her once, "Oh, your research slip is showing," which is so clever because it's like, oh, right.
It's like, oh, I'm so smart.
But you do have to know the whole iceberg for that little part that peaks above the surface.
Yeah, I mean, you do. You have to know as much as you can know, right? And then, like, so I think for most of us, like, the research always starts with, it's at our fingertips now. Like once upon a time it wasn't, but now it is. So it starts there. And then if you need more, then you need a book. And then if you need more, then you need a person. And that's kind of how that's kind of how it works for me. Well, like for Crazy Love You, remember about my graphic novels? Like this is like one of the rare times where I had this voice in my head, and I knew Ian Payne was like sort of, he was like just really, he was disturbed. He was addicted. He had so many problems. He had like unhealed trauma, and the only thing I knew for sure about him was that he was a graphic novelist. And I didn't know anything about graphic novels, so I called Gregg. I said, I don't know anything about this. Like, can you help me? And he's like, why? Why are you writing about this? I'm like, I don't know. That's just what the guy is. That's what he is. I need to learn. And so he put me in touch with a good friend of his, and I learned what I needed to know in order to, have Ian be what, he came to me as.
I wrote comics for a lot of years. I wrote Batman and Wolverine, Punisher. It was super fun.
It's cool.
And so, like writing for DC and Marvel is like, do you remember that rich kid who used to live up the block from you growing up who had all the best toys? That's what it's like writing for Marvel or DC. You just go and you're like, oh, Batman? Sure. Wolverine?
Yeah.
So I was in it a bit. But, one of the things is, it's so funny because some people say there's that old saw that says, write what you know. And I always think that's the worst possible.
It is the worst.
I think what we want to do is be driven by curiosity.
Right, exactly. Write what you can imagine, right? And then, seek the knowledge, right?
Well, whatever like weird, perverse stuff. Like I feel like any dark corner of the culture that interests me or intrigues me, I get to wander over and like shine a light into.
Exactly.
And then explore it.
Yeah.
But I think that's true in a weird way. I think it's true in any field almost. In any person. If you follow the thing that's the most interesting to you.
Yeah.
And then nothing makes sense, but if you look back, there's a pattern you can discern of what happened, of why it made sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
How was the writing of this one? Was it smooth writing?
Yeah, the writing was kind of an interesting way that this story told itself. I came into it through Maverick Dillon, who's like, sort of my YouTube celebrity, or in the book it's We Watch, because I don't want to follow anybody else's rules. So I wanted my own sort of platform. And it was really his voice. And I was super interested in him because he was, very different from me. He's an adrenaline junkie, somebody who wants to do all these, stage all these extreme things. He grew up in front of the camera. He did all these kinds of stunts as a kid. And then he gets his group of guys together and they start going all over the world and doing it and they're filming it. And so he's like somebody who's extremely different from me. And he's just always performing right for the camera. There's a piece of him that only exists when the camera is on him. And so I was really interested in that. And then I'm always interested in that kind of technology because, it's not really the technology itself. It's not like YouTube or how it works or SpawnCon or anything like that. That's not what interests me. What interests me about technology is how it's rewriting the way we relate to each other. Mm-hmm. And so that's the piece that I really wanted to kind of dig into with him. So he was really my first person. But then I have all these other people, Adele, who is a different person from Maverick entirely, but she's also sort of turned to We Watch, to kind of empower herself. She's got this We Watch channel where she's gotten herself in shape and she's doing all these competitions and she's helping other women become empowered as well. We have Malika, who is this, she's the youngest woman to have climbed all the 7 summits. And then we have Wild Cody, who was a kid's, television personality, nature survivalist, but then he has had a terrible fall from grace. So he's kind of on the redemption circuit. So there's all these different people and they had these different, and I had these different ways of accessing them. So there's some of it's internal, but sometimes we're seeing them from the perspective of them broadcasting themselves. And then sometimes we're seeing them from the perspective of a video diary. And there's a podcast, there's a piece of it that's being told through the podcast. And so what I was interested in was all these different perspectives. What is real? Are you real when you're performing for a camera? Are you real when you're engaging with your life and the people that you love or supposedly love and your friends? Is there a difference between those two? When we take a podcast or we watch something like a game of extreme hide and seek on YouTube or whatever it is, is that real or is it just performed? And then how confused are we now as people in this culture between what is real and what is performed, even in the case of our own lives?
Yeah, so, we're coming off our evolutionary design in a lot of ways.
Post-human.
It used to be you'd go back to school after the summer, and if 2 of your friends went on a trip, you'd hear about it the first day back at school, and you'd be busy.
Right.
But now, if the kids are on phones, you're seeing these curated, wonderful images, by the hour of this other thing. You mentioned with Maverick, there's a discussion where one of the characters says that he's really kind and cares about people when he's alone. Mm-hmm. But there's this whole other side to him versus the performative side.
Right.
It's really interesting because I think when people are fed in an online persona, it's very easy for the incentive structures to get out of whack.
Yeah.
And you can see this a lot in how people radicalize online, where they start off kind of centristy, but if you tick more outrage, you get more feedback.
That's right.
And then you start feeding it, and then reality reshapes itself around you, and then you start to enter different silos.
Yeah.
It's weird. I play with that a little bit.
Right. I was gonna say, there's a lot of stuff like that in the Orphan X books.
Yeah. Well, in Nemesis too. This is the first one in terms of Evan's arc to becoming more of a human. this is the first time where he's up against someone who's basically his only friend in the world. He's the only guy who he trusts. He's his armorer.
Mm-hmm.
He's his ordnance guy. He's based on a friend of mine who passed away 4 years ago now, who was a great, like, crusty old UDT diver, pre-SEAL Team 6 in the Wavy Navy, he used to say. And he's like Evan's best friend, but Evan finds out that he sold weapons that killed someone who's innocent. And he has this kind of uncrossable line in his code, this rigid code that he has. So Tommy's gone back, to, a square state that I don't name.
Mm-hmm.
He's helping these kids from a small rural town that's like the town he grew up in. It's very different than Evan, who grew up in East Baltimore foster home with all kinds of different people and colors and cultures around him. And Evan's kind of coming for Tommy. But at the same time, the reader is meeting the people who Tommy's living among, and they're also accessing the people who Evan's among. And so it's this interesting thing where, like, if I just stereotyped who the characters are, who Tommy's among, and the problems he's trying to fix, they'd be people who are repellent to us. But since we're spending more time with them, it's like this line. Somebody said this in Dallas, where I was on, just finishing up a book torn out. Somebody said that one of the things he thought about with the book is it's hard to hate up close.
Exactly.
In a weird way, it's like we're meeting these characters who in any other Orphan X book, we'd be cheering for Evan to go kill them all. Mm-hmm. But we're spending more time with them than with Evan. And so in a weird way in this book, for the first time, I think readers are almost rooting against Evan for parts of it.
Right, because in a way he's like, his code is like, it's so rigid. Right, like, and he has to come up against that himself as well.
Well, when do we change our mind?
Right,
I've never heard somebody say, like, oh, I changed my mind on some major spiritual or political belief because I read an op-ed in the Atlantic.
Right.
It's always when somebody who we love, who you have a
That's
relationship
right.
with
That's
that
right.
you can't break, who's
Mm-hmm.
undeniably good,
Mm-hmm.
does something or believes something or votes in a way or acts in a way that you can't square, but you can't just throw them out and cancel them or unfriend them. And so then my dad always says, a good friend is a mirror.
Mm-hmm.
And so those moments of conflict that we have with people where, part of it is looking up going, is it my code that's missing? Because I'm pretty sure that this is an irretrievable problem or an irredeemable, I should say, mistake.
Right.
But so Evan's trying to figure that out. That's all that messy space in the middle. That's all the gray. None of this is covered by what he's accustomed to.
Right. And he's very, very uncomfortable in the gray.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we take some questions?
Oh, yeah.
Does anyone have any questions?
These guys seem like they're going to be shy.
I just want to say, I got your book and I read it in 2 days.
Oh my
I couldn't
God.
put it down. It was riveting.
Thank you so much.
And I have a question. Your characters are so multifaceted and very nuanced, and I wanted to know, what is your process when you create a character?
Yeah, I really stopped thinking about characters as people that I create and a long time ago, and started thinking of them as people that I meet, because that's kind of the way I experience them, even though that's not the truth of it. I'm the author, I'm writing a book, I'm on some level creating character. But like for me, it's very organic, it's very subconscious. So like, for example, when I started writing about Adele, the only thing that I knew about her was that, she was in this principal's office. Her son Blake's being bullied, and his glasses have been smashed. And she's in this principal's office, and she's like in a place of despair. She's like been struggling to take care of her family. She, doesn't know what to do about the fact that her son keeps getting bullied because he won't say who it is. And then she looks around this office, and this principal has this like wonderfully intact life. There's like this beautiful picture of his family and all his, awards and degrees on the wall. And she just feels less than. Like she just is in that moment. And that's what I knew about her when she showed up on the page. But then as like that chapter progressed, I started to see this other layer of her where she had like gotten herself, sort of clawed her way back from this traumatic event with her husband, and that, she had created this channel where she was like making herself stronger and like helping other women make themselves stronger. And so like as the chapter progressed and you got to know Adele a little bit better, like from the beginning to the end of chapter 1, that's how I got to know her. And that's how I get to know everybody. It's actually in the writing that I get to know my characters. Like they evolve for me on the page the same way that they do for you, like very much the same way. So I don't have like character sketches or like, do any like, any like other writing, outside the book to try to get into that character space. Like I let them reveal themselves to me because that's how any good relationship goes, right? Just kind of let it evolve. So that's how it works for me.
Do you go back and rewrite early? Like when you're at the end and Adele so much better, do you go back sometimes when you're reading and go, wait, that's not her tone?
Well, there's a lot of like, in the morning, like I'm a very early morning writer, like 5 to noon, like those are my golden creative hours. Like I start every day reading what I wrote the day before. So a lot of times in that moment, there's rewriting in that time. Like I might come and then, obviously in editorial, I might switch things around or, obviously flesh things out or cut things or but like, as far as character, like I wouldn't go back necessarily. I haven't necessarily had to go back and change like the essence of the character. Like for me, that person is very real. And so it's not like I can go back and say, oh, let me just, X out her trauma, like her childhood trauma. Like that doesn't work anymore. Like that's not how it works for me. Like that person was formed by that trauma. That is that person. And that trauma informed everything they did in the rest of the book. And so like for me, it's real. So it would be difficult for me to change character in that way, in that deep way. I can change the incident. I can flesh out, I can move things around, but like the person is, evolves in that way very, very, like it's almost like a tapestry. If you start to pull that thread, the whole thing unravels. Yeah. Hi.
So are you a plotter, or do you kind of just, if you get to the end and you're like, oh, okay, this is how we did it.
Yeah, I don't really think of myself as I'm definitely not a plotter. I don't like the word pantser either, like, because that's the other thing about it. It's like as if accidentally by the seat of your pants you wrote a novel. Like, no, like that's not really how it works. I like to think of myself more as a gardener. Like a seed gets planted and like something starts to grow and you give it like light and air and water and then like you do some trimming and whatnot, like as you go, and then at the end of it, like 9 to 12 months, there's something, a tree, a bush, whatever it is, and like that's sort of how it works for me. Like it kind of every story starts with a seed or maybe multiple things. Like in this case, like the collision of a couple of things, and then I let it sort of evolve over the course of a year, and that's my first draft. Which, I think weirdly, I've been doing some thinking about this. Like, I don't think plotting and, pantsing or gardening are really that different. It's just that people who plot, tend to want to create a scaffolding, right? And then go back and fill in what's in between that scaffolding. I don't want a scaffolding. Like, I just want to build it brick by brick. Like that's how it works for me. I mean, it just takes me a little bit longer, but it's maybe kind of the same thing in a way. And then I don't know that like, my intellect, that's an intellectual process, the writing of an outline or creating a scaffolding. And like, I think my creative brain would just get annoyed by that. It would just be like, how dare you? Like, how dare you try to tell me what to do, even though like it was me or one side or one part of me, like that, that part of my brain that,
it's always good to talk to yourself with disdain.
I mean, you do have, it's like, it's a conflict, right? I mean, it's like the creative part, like it needs its space. And, the intellectual is like, has to be like this. Well, Jack says what? He says, good is the enemy of great.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But this is like the opposite.
Don't let the good be the enemy of the great.
Right.
Yeah.
Hi, you guys are wonderful. My name's Sonia, and it's a pleasure to hear you guys.
Thanks for being here.
Could you talk a little bit more in depth about your writing process?
Yeah.
I mean, you have like over 20 books. Do you write 2 at the same time? How? And another question is, how have you progressed, say, from the first novel to now? And is there anything you do differently?
Yeah.
I know that's a lot.
Sure. Well, we have a lot of writers in here, I think.
We do, which is great.
I love that. So I started off, I was really young. I started my first book, I was 19.
Wow.
And I wrote an absolutely terrible rough draft, largely the summers before my junior year, then senior year, then after senior year of college. And I had to take the entire book apart like an engine block. Like there's not a way to start writing a novel without doing it and screwing it up. It's like being in a relationship. You can't just start and know what you're doing.
I
Or
have a
being a
terrible
parent.
relationship.
Yeah, that's it. In fact, we're going to talk about that now. But, so then the second book was the same thing. It wasn't until my third book that the rough draft resembled like a decent, if shitty, rough draft of a novel. Then I started to outline, and I outlined a little bit more and more before I just threw it out again completely. And now I do something that's a combination of both. I work off what I call a rolling outline. So I have, to my desk, I have stapled to the desk or attached to the desk is a widescreen TV, and there's room for 2 documents side by side. Before I start writing, I usually have about 17 to 25 pages of just bullet points. Snippets of dialogue, character ideas, moments of violence, right? Things that are compelling, themes. It's just a mess, right? It's just a kind of vomit draft dump. And that's the clay. And so when I start writing the book, I usually know my first 3 or 4 chapters. So I kind of shape up the clay. I put everything in some rough order. And then as I'm writing, I'm constantly rewriting, and the outline kind of expands and it bloats. And at some point I'm like, oh my God, it's going to be like a Tolstoy length novel, right? But then at some point it starts to condense. And when it's done, I basically have a 400-page novel here and an empty document, which I then trash. So the key is to keep this. If I'm writing and I have one of those moments, one of your gardening moments, I go, oh, wait, let me drop a handkerchief here, but this can happen somewhere in the middle, and then I can pay this off at the end. And so one of the ways I think of this, we're being very metaphor rich in our writing right now, but have you all seen those indoor rock climbing walls? So I have to know that I have enough holds to get across the wall, but I don't know if I'm going to get there with my left hand or my right foot. But I know there's a big chunky scene in the second act that I can hold on to. And so once I know that, I start to fill in and do that. And so it's a constant process of shaping up both things.
Yeah. And that's how you've always done it. Like,
well,
after those first 3, that's been your process since that time.
Yeah, well, I outlined a little more and more, and then I blew it all up for my 8th book, which was called The Crime Writer.
Yeah.
And then after that, thank you. I've settled in, and then this is just something that is like the best process for me.
Yeah.
But it's super annoying. Like today I just went to work out and came home and like chunked in, like I was down to like 17 pages and now I'm back to like 23 on outline. Right. So it's like, but I'm like, wait a minute, this whole thing needs to happen and I need to do this. So I'm constantly writing on it, but it's shorthand. And then when I'm rough drafting, that's that flow that's necessary where like it's a cadence.
Right.
And, Michael Conley talks about that being like if you're surfing and you're in the wave, the water's all around you. You can't see anything but story. And if I can find that in the rough, it's great. But I know I have some anchor, even if it's rough over here.
Right. Yeah, I actually started my first novel also when I was 19 years old. I was still in college. And, when I graduated, even though I had always been a writer and I never really thought of myself any other way, like I just didn't have the confidence to pursue that, And so I went into publishing after college and, unfortunately I was just like really, really good at my job as a book publicist. And it just, right, Robert? Right. Wasn't that great? Wasn't that awesome? And so my job just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the time I spent writing got smaller and smaller until, I just kind of had this epiphany, right? That I was like, that everything in my life was wrong. It was with the wrong guy, not my husband. I was like in a job that I didn't love, but that I was giving 110% of myself. And so I had this moment where I was like, you're going to have to look back 5 years, 10 years from now and say, you never even tried. You never even tried to do it. And I figured I could live with like sort of, spectacular crash and burn failure, but I wasn't going to be able to live with a slow fade to nothing. So that's when I got really serious about that novel that I started when I was 19. It took me another year to write that novel, like kind of in the nooks and crannies of my life because I had a full-time job. So I was writing in the mornings and I was writing, after work, and I was like staying in on the weekends to work on it. It took me about a year to finish that book. So that book I started when I was 19. I finished it when I was 29. It took me 10 years, which is, it's not that long. It's not that complicated. It didn't need to take 10 years, but I needed 10 years, I think, to get to that place, to finish the book. And also like to, like my dad who recently passed, he's an engineer And, when I told him I wanted to be a writer, he was basically like, yeah, no, don't do that, right? That's not a job. People don't do that for a living. You need to, it doesn't need to pay well, but it does need to pay every 2 weeks. So I kind of had that in my head, right? And so it was like, all these years of working in publishing where I started to realize, this actually is a job. In fact, there's like a whole industry that's sprung up around, people who are doing this work. And so like, I kind of needed to give myself permission to be, what I am. And so from that point, like actually after I finished that book, I met my husband, Jeff, in Key West at Sloppy Joe's. I know what you're thinking. Usually relationships that start at Sloppy Joe's are like a little more short term. But this is our 25th wedding anniversary.
Wow.
And so, I had this novel that I had finished, and I met Jeff, and within 6 months he had proposed, and I took we both quit our big corporate jobs and picked another city, and I took my manuscript and I sent it to my 5 top choice agents, and I decided I'm giving myself 1 year to sell this book and to write another one. And that's what I did. I got signed on pretty quickly by my agent. She brokered a 2-book deal with St. Martin's Press. And from that point forward, like I was still doing like freelance public relations writing, but that's when I was like, basically a full-time writer. And so that's when those mornings started for me, the 5 a.m. to noon. Those are my golden creative hours. I still write in those hours. I don't always get those hours. Sometimes I write, writing in the afternoon as well. I really do start with just a character voice, and every day I have no idea who's going to show up. I have no idea what they're going to do. I have this essence of what the book is going to be. Like I have a kind of a vibe about it, and I have no idea how it's going to end. Because if I did, I wouldn't be able to write it.
There's 2 things that occur to me, 2 pieces of advice that I got or received that I always tell writers, that both of which make sense. The first one is make your writing time sacrosanct.
Absolutely.
Because nobody else will.
Nobody
cares.
Nobody cares.
But it's not like, doctors get up and they're like, I don't know, do I want a doctor today?
Exactly.
And so you have to carve it out. There's always going to be more important things to do. Dry cleaning, clean your office, do your job, go to a movie, return phone calls. You have to just decide that time is sacred. And there's a selfishness to it, almost like being an athlete, where you're like, this is it. This is what I'm doing.
Yeah.
The other thing is, and this is something I learned early on. There's a great quotation about this, which I would paraphrase terribly, but it's by David Bowie. And basically the version I think of it is, don't be afraid to fail on your own terms. There's nothing worse than failing on other people's terms.
Yeah.
So do the thing that you love. And if you fail, it's like rush to failure and reset. You can always do it a little bit better next time around.
Exactly.
And that's part of it. Like a lot of people get hung up too on the blank page, and it's like, just write down a vomit draft. You can't fix a blank page. You can make it better. But when you're striving for the thing that you most want to do, you most want to be, you most want to spend your time, you can fail at that and it's no problem. You just don't want to fail pursuing someone else's version of what you should be doing.
Yeah. And I do agree with that. Like, a lot of people feel like, or think that there's like some romance to it. Like, there's going to be this magic, moment of inspiration. The muse comes, and there is a sort of magic to it. It's true. Like there's things about what I do that I don't 100% even understand. But what I do know is that you schedule that time and you honor that schedule. You honor it like you would honor anything else that's important to you. And if you show up there at the same time every day or every week or whatever it is that you have, then you'll be amazed at how often the muse or creativity or whatever it is meets you there.
If it doesn't work, there's always Mai Tais at Sloppy Joe's.
Or Facebook stalking your ads or fan cat videos or whatever.
Sure thing. Yes.
I think you both have written standalone novels and a series recurring characters. Do you find one easier than the other to write?
I mean, I like both. I really sort of have a group of novels that's like sort of chain linked by place, a fictional town called the Hollows. And I sort of, those characters sort of come out of that place and show up in other books. So I feel like it's really, for me, it's more like, about the, characters and where they need to be in the story. I love having something that, kind of grows and changes. Like the Hollows became like sort of, when I first sort of started writing about it, I didn't really think that much of it. It just seemed like the place where nothing bad ever happens. And of course that's nowhere, because bad things happen everywhere. And so I do love it when it, sort of shows up and it has another, piece that moves it forward. Like there's like a, a thing that's happening that, it's moving towards another book there. But it's really just character. So whatever is loudest in my head, like I don't feel attached to a specific series or a specific set of characters and their story. It's just sort of whatever happens to be going on in the moment for me.
Should I answer that too?
I think so.
I'm very inclined towards standalones. And one of the things I love about standalones is that the question of motive is up for grabs. So it's like, why does Hercule Poirot take a case? Like, it's his job. Why does James Bond go on a mission? It's his job. And I loved in standalones that, I could have the motivation be, well, somebody's curious or somebody's envious. You could pick a character up wherever and leave them off. And I think, I'd written another series of 4 books called the Tim Rackley series early in my career, but it was always going to be shorter. And I think one of the things I waited for so long with Orphan X is that I wanted to find a situation with a character where stories could arrive from a whole bunch of different views. So he has an encrypted phone number now. Ever since he left the assassin program, his number is 1-855-2-nowhere. You can actually call the phone number and Orphan X will actually answer the phone. And it's where people call who are in like desperate need. And he sort of is a pro bono assassin who will, like, they're just being terrorized by some set of circumstances and he will do anything to liberate them from that. But then there's also the mythology story of the orphan program he came from, and there's assassins pursuing him. And that's kind of like in X-Files, where they had like their case of the week, and then occasionally there'd be a mythology act, And then the last thing is that Evan was one of the other things for me that I really wanted to distinguish the series is he's this archetypal hero, like Reacher or Bourne, but he lives in the real world with you and me. And so he'll come from like a brutal knife fight and he's bleeding through his, shirt and hiding it wrapped. And then he'll get like dragged into the HOA meeting right on his way in because he lives in like this penthouse apartment on the Wilshire corridor. And, he's under this cover identity and everyone's having this vehement argument over whether like kombucha should be included in the morning beverage initiative. And he's getting like death threats pinged in on his phone. And he's just trying to hold center because he's hiding among ordinary people. And once I had that piece, it was another avenue for stories and new ideas to come in. So I didn't feel as entangled. I'd say the combination between that and knowing that I was setting the template to be a character who's becoming more human and is learning, in the beginning, he's a lone wolf. He's got his face up to the glass and he's seeing all these people who lead these ordinary lives that he himself could never have. But he can at least be the wolf that hunts other wolves to protect and preserve that for them. And so living among ordinary people, once there's all this opportunity for him to move towards humanity and have all these different ways that stories can grab him, then I had enough flexibility. And this is the 10th book in the series now. Though, you can jump on with any one of them. I reset and they're very standalone in their field.
I was going to say that you're really adept at that. Like every book does kind of stand alone and you have this, really efficient way of like, sort of bringing forward the information that's needed for the overarching story. And it works very well. But they all do, very much so standalone, I think. So you don't have to start at the beginning.
Movies. Like Orphan X is more like you talked about Bourne, I know you have history in it. Your books also kind of have some of those elements that you can see.
Yeah.
How is what are your thoughts on, do you want your books to become movies? Do you not, what kind of role would you play in it?
Well, I have, so Confessions on the 745 is in development at Hulu. And it'll be a limited edition series. We have Jessica Alba, Eva Longoria to direct, and Charisse Castro-Smith to write. And we have a pilot. but it's slow. It's very slow. My project is. Other people's projects seem to go very quickly, but mine is like glacial. But really talented people and great vision. And I read the pilot, and I really loved it. It's just very, very different. But I could see what she mined from the book and created a more sort of visual way of beginning the book. And I was, and I loved it. I thought it was great. And so I always feel like, I know people have all sorts of feels about, when their books are turned into film, and some people love it and some people hate it. But at this stage for me, it just feels kind of amazing that something that I write, the book is mine. It'll always be mine, but it inspired somebody else to write something else. And it's a completely different form, and it's a completely different thing. And so I feel like I could be at peace with whatever that winds up being. So I feel like the book is always mine, and whatever is created from that, if it ever, finds its way to where we're all hoping it's going to go, that I'll be at peace with whatever they create. It'll be their thing.
That's the best attitude to have.
Yeah.
It's funny. The 2 movies I've had made were both original screenplays.
Yeah.
One was called The Book of Henry, starring Naomi Watts, and another was called Sweet Girl, starring Jason Momoa, which basically meant that every woman who I knew, including my wife, wanted to be on set. But for Orphan X, one of the things you have to do is you have to choose really, really carefully who you partner with. So Orphan X, the first time I adapted it, I went around, I adapted it for a big kind of A-list movie star who was fantastic, lost him to another huge movie that he won a bunch of Oscars for, and so fair enough. And then I got the rights back. I'm very careful in who I'm placing it with now. We're going to have an announcement soon. But as the novelist side, the only thing you really have is who you surround yourself with and who your partners are. And I always feel like either, it's like a relationship. It's getting better, it's getting worse. Like I said, that
Right.
production
Exactly.
is working or it's not. You either
Right.
surround yourselves with people who are brilliant, who are raising the game, and it's a positive feedback loop, or you're like the drunk asshole outside the bar at like 3 a.m. with a broken bottle, and you're like trying to protect your script from like savages who are attacking you. And so it's so important who you choose to partner with, because what you want is for people to bring the best of what they have and can do and elevate it. Because you think about the best adaptations are never slavish to the books, right? You think about Jaws is so different from the book. Godfather deviates. Heart of Darkness, right, turned into Apocalypse Now. So you want
The Orchid Thief. And
Orchid Thief is
adaptation.
wild,
I know, it's so good.
So you want there to be room to allow the formats work differently too. I've worked in TV, comics, film, and novels. And you want to do things that can only be done in that medium. That's always what you want to do. I think it's why there's some of these rules that occur to us, where you shouldn't have too much voiceover in a movie. And sometimes it works great, like in Shawshank Redemption. But for the most part, you don't want it because that mimics a book. You want visual. You want what's seen and heard. You want to maximize that. And so I've had a lot of experiences with that where it goes beautifully on set and you can't even believe how much something's elevated by somebody else's talent that's different, that takes the core of something. So that's the hope. That's the great hope.
Anything else, you guys?
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Okay, should we do 2 more?
Oh,
and then
yeah.
sign some
Mine's
up?
quick, but I was just gonna say, earlier you said you shouldn't write what you know and you should kind of explore the unknown. But I was hearing you talk and I was just thinking, doesn't that provide the places you visited and things that have kind of formed who you are as a person? Isn't that how you write from your perspective? In other words, I guess I'm wondering if it's kind of a blend of the two when you ultimately sit down to write, because you can't really escape the
What you know.
experiences and the
Right.
environment that you grew up with. But I also think it's very interesting as a writer to kind of challenge yourself and kind of do explore the unknown.
Right.
And also, is Sloppy Joe's at any point in your writing sort of a background or a future? I think that's such a cool story. It's
It's our meet cute. If
Yeah.
I write a rom-com, maybe
Yeah,
I'll
there
maybe I'll fit that in like a rom-com thriller. Maybe it'll start at Sloppy Joe's or something like that. But yeah, I think that's a good point. Like I was saying earlier, it's kind of it's really a continuum as a writer. If you're writing the way we write, authentically, it is. It's what you know. It's like what you live, what you experience, where you go, what you observe, what you read, and then it's like what you read, and then what you're researching, and that becomes also what you know, and then you're writing, and that leads you to more reading and researching and experiencing. And so I think it's really just it's a continuum. I think maybe it's like, there's just like, it's like stock advice, like write what you know, and like some people get caught up in that. Like I can only write, especially when you're young. And I can only write from my limited experience of like, where I grew up and what I know from my family and what I know from my, my small, piece of the world, right? And, but then when that knowledge starts to expand and you know more and you imagine more and you learn more, then that, maybe that, that piece of advice becomes more, more expansive than limiting.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotations about writing is from Joan Didion, and she says, "I write so I know what I think." It's so great.
Yeah.
And so, I do
Exactly.
all this research, like, I've never taken my daughter into a forbidden building. I mean, what kind of parent would do that? But like, I've gone up in stunt airplanes. I've snuck into demolition ranges with SEALs and blown up cars. I've gone undercover to mind control cults. Like, I do everything to give the reader a front row seat to the action. Like, I've shot every gun Orphan X is on. I've done mixed martial arts training. Not particularly well, but got my ass kicked a lot, so I could write about it in a way that isn't cliched. But what's interesting, what I was thinking about with your question, is that thing of, like, one of the things I love so much about the American transcendental poets is they thought like the design of the world is in nature and it's in children, and that our whole job is to reclaim that. Like, well, Wordsworth, the life is but a birth and a forgetting. Like, we're born, we're super pure, we get wounded, everything, like, guards go up, we get reactive, the outside world assails us, we form a kind of persona, and so much of what you're trying to do in life is to clear that away and get back to who you really are, but with a integration of experience. That's like William Blake wrote Songs of Innocence and then Songs of Experience. And Songs of Innocence is like, little lamb, who made thee? And Songs of Experience is tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. Right, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? And so you want the innocence of where you are. And I think if writing, if we quote Ms. Didion, is an effort to know what we think, it's an effort, I think, in a lot of ways to get to the purest version of how we can express ourselves. And one of the things that's so interesting when I talk to young writers, I always say, like, the way you think and where you came from, I'm so glad you brought that up, like what your dynamics, what everything is, how you think about things, how you approach things, how you are in your friendships. That's that voice everyone talks about. It's like you go find some voice somewhere. Your voice has to be the way that you live in the world and perceive the world and articulate yourself. It's like this weird prism that's an outlet that you're trying to like polish off and find again while integrating all the experience to it. And so it's a very weird process of integration, I think. Did you have a question?
I do. I'm enjoying this so much. I do not even have the words, honestly. This has been fabulous.
Thank you.
I'm so glad to learn about the two of you. I'm embarrassed because this is new for me.
That's great.
But I'm very interested in buying both of your books. And
You shouldn't be embarrassed. That's the whole point of us going to a bookstore is that you get to meet new
We're
readers.
so glad you're here. Thank you.
but my question is this. I'm very interested in, your first book in this series because I'm really curious to see where you take it. So I guess I'd like to know the name of the first one in the Orphan X series.
It's a wildly innovative name called Orphan X.
It starts with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just name it right out the gates.
I just have to say that I just started listening. Actually, first time I'm actually listening to an entire book audio, and it's about Elon Musk by Walter Isaacson. And I'm telling you, this guy, I recommend it. It's really, really something.
Interesting.
Anyway,
You just won another award for your audiobook, didn't you?
Yeah, I have a wonderful audiobook reader.
Oh.
Hang on. I might do something now. Let's see if this works, if I can get reception in here. So my audiobook reader is a guy called Scott Breck. And for those of you who are audio fanatics, he's really is like the gold standard. He's just, there's a number of wonderful audio readers. I was going to just call Orphan X, but I don't know if I have enough of a signal.
Oh, is it him? Did he do that?
Shh, it's Orphan X.
Oh, sorry.
Let's see.
Do you need my help? Where did you get this number? Listen very carefully to what I have to tell you. Your life depends on it. Before we can meet, it's imperative. I have to go. I'll contact you later.
I love that.
So great. So literally before I sold my first book, I wrote, 1-855 to nowhere is the number people call when they need him. And I was like, look, if editors are going to buy this book and they come upon that number, they're going to call the number. So I drove over to Scott's. He lives in LA. He's wonderful. I hate when he comes to my book signings because he talks and everyone's like, everyone looks behind him and then I have to read and I'm like, Orphan X, slow down. So anyway, I went over to Scott's and I was like, look, man, this manuscript's going out. You got to just record something, put it together for me. And so he was the voice of Orphan X before the series even started. And
So cool.
I think I'm the first person to have in my contracts that it has to be Scott Gregg.
Oh, nice.
He's
Love that.
wonderful.
Oh, that's great.
It's a really weird, different talent.
It is.
Because if you're too
So
dramatic, it really takes you out. And
Right.
if you're a male narrator and you go too high pitched with the women or too hard in accents,
Yeah.
you sound really
That's so true.
weird or offensive.
Yeah.
I think as Scott is like he's the conductor in every section of the orchestra.
Yeah.
He just he's just wonderful. It's the right level of all of it. So
Yeah, I really love my audio narrator as well, Vivian Lahaney. She's absolutely amazing.
such an audio narrator name.
Yeah, right. Isn't it? And
Vivian
she's-
Lahaney.
And every time I listen, because we always get samples every time. I always like whenever I hear her voice reading my work, I always get goosebumps, and so like that's how I know she's perfect.
So
She's
good.
perfect.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yeah,
Shirley.
We have books to buy, and I'm sure they'll say you're inside.
We
And
will,
yeah,
of
thank you guys
course.
so much for being here.
Yeah.